At 25,000 feet inside a metal compartment barely 2 meters wide, a 24-year-old American soldier sat alone at the tail of a B-17, facing down hundreds of incoming German fighters. The manual told him to wait. Statistics told him he would die soon. But one decision, one that defied doctrine, forced the entire U.S. Air Force to rewrite how it fought in the skies over Europe. If you want to understand how an anonymous tail gunner could change the course of aerial warfare, stay with History War until the very end. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling these true war stories, where it's people, not slogans, that determine the fate of an era. 6:15 a.m. Not the glorious dawn you see on recruitment posters, but a pale, silvery gray light, thin and cold, creeping slowly across the damp concrete of RAF Kimballton Airfield. The fog hadn't fully lifted. It clung to the metal like a second skin, making every surface slick, cold, and lifeless. At the edge of the runway, the B-17s stood motionless, tall and heavy, like giant beasts holding their breath before charging into hostile skies. Michael Aruth walked among them, neither rushing nor hesitating. 24 years old. A face still too young for what lay ahead. His boots tapped softly on the concrete, the dry sound vanishing into the mist. He didn't look around for anyone. He didn't need words of luck. There were no bold farewells here. Those things didn't exist. Not now. Not in this place. He climbed onto the aircraft, his hand brushing against the ice-cold aluminum. The chill wasn't just in the air. It had seeped into the metal itself, waiting to pass into human skin. Crawling into the tail section, his world shrank to a narrow, sealed-off space, completely cut off from the rest of the crew. The door shut. Outside noise was muffled. From that moment on, Aruth, the tail gunner's compartment, was not made for comfort. A small bicycle-style seat, just enough to sit on for hours without being able to stretch your legs. 2 .50 caliber Brownings mounted on either side, dark and cold, like loyal creatures with no emotion. In front of him, a sheet of plexiglass, so thin it was hard to believe anyone expected it to stop metal traveling at hundreds of meters per second. Just a layer of clear plastic separating life from death. At combat altitude, the temperature would drop to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Breath froze into white mist before his face. Blood, if spilled, would freeze faster than pain could reach the brain. They called it the loneliest job in the war, and it wasn't just for drama. In the tail, there was no one to talk to, no one to share the fear with, just the open sky behind, vast and empty, where the enemy would come from. Aruth had flown 12 missions. That number might seem small, but in this world, it meant something else entirely. On average, a tail gunner only survived 11 missions, not because they lacked courage, but because the geometry of aerial combat was never in their favor. The rear of the bomber formation was always the easiest path for predators, and the man sitting here was always the one to see death coming. Closest and clearest. The engines roared to life. The plane vibrated, lightly at first, then stronger. That sound wasn't encouragement, it was a reminder. It was too late to turn back. As the wheels lifted from the runway, the fog tore apart beneath them, and the ground dropped away. Aruth didn't look down. He looked back, through the plexiglass, into the endless void. In his mind, numbers surfaced coldly. Distance, speed, firing angles, all the things they drilled into him during training, all the things that made sense in a classroom under electric lights with blackboards and model planes. Wait until the enemy is within 300 yards. Fire short bursts, conserve ammo, stay calm. It all sounded logical, clean, precise, but the sky wasn't clean, and war wasn't precise. Aruth remembered earlier flights, moments when he did everything by the book and still watched B-17s next to him torn apart in seconds. Fighters appearing like phantoms, diving in from behind, 20mm cannons flashing, and then vanishing, leaving holes, screams ripped away by wind, and a missing gap in the formation. In the tail, there was no room for romance. Every second was a survival equation. Every decision came with a cost in flesh and bone. And the more missions he flew, the more Aruth felt a terrifying dissonance between what he'd been taught and what was actually happening. The plane climbed higher. The air thinned. Sunlight filtering through the glass turned cold and pale, offering no warmth. In his headset, the pilot's voice came through, brief, professional. Everything was by the book, according to protocol, according to plan. But Aruth knew, somewhere ahead, in the skies over Germany, That plan would be tested to the breaking point. Up there, no one cared what you'd learned or how well you followed orders. Up there was only one question. Are you still alive? He placed his hands on the triggers, feeling the familiar weight of the metal. He didn't squeeze. Not yet. Not time. But inside, a seed of doubt had started to grow. If waiting, as the manual instructed, gave the enemy more time to aim and fire, was that really the smart move? If training told him to be patient, but reality showed that the patient often died before pulling the trigger, then what should he believe? The sky behind remained empty, eerily quiet. But Aruth knew that silence was only temporary. It was like breath held before a punch, and when it released, everything would unfold in a matter of seconds, leaving no room for hesitation. In that freezing tail compartment, surrounded by the steady drone of engines and the constant vibration of metal, Michael Aruth began to realize something dangerous. Maybe the rules designed to protect him were actually putting him in the deadliest position. Maybe doctrine, with all its cold logic, was slowly getting tail gunners killed by teaching them to wait in a war that punished waiting. And once that thought took shape, it was no longer just an idea. It became a heavy question, hanging in the tail like a storm cloud, heavier than the minus 60-degree air. If the manual teaches you to wait, but war teaches you to die, who do you listen to? The doctrine Michael Aruth was trained in wasn't born out of cruelty. It was crafted by people in closed rooms, surrounded by blackboards, maps, rulers, and equations that made cold, logical sense. On paper, everything checked out. Wait until the enemy was within 300 yards. At that range, the target was large enough to avoid wasting rounds. Fire in short bursts to keep the barrels cool. Conserve ammunition, because in the sky, every bullet was a heartbeat. Don't panic. Don't shoot early. Don't break formation. If every gunner followed the rules, the formation would form an impenetrable wall of fire. It sounded perfect. It sounded scientific. And in training, where the mock planes followed ideal paths, where there were no screaming winds, no exploding flak, no crewmates torn apart in front of your eyes, that doctrine had no visible flaws. It was so convincing, it became truth. But the skies over Germany were no classroom. In enemy airspace, the geometry of aerial combat turned every theory into a life-or-death gamble. Attacking from the 6 o'clock position, dead behind the bombers, was the shortest, straightest, and most lethal route. A Bf-109 or FW-190 didn't need to maneuver, didn't need to show off. It just had to charge straight in at high speed, squeeze the trigger for a few seconds, and then veer off. 10 seconds. That was the length of an attack. 10 seconds to decide who would live and who would die. A 20mm cannon wasn't a machine gun. A single burst could shred aluminum, blow out windows, snap control wires. One round could ignite the oxygen tanks. Another could turn the tail compartment into an airborne coffin. And in those 10 seconds, if a tail gunner waited until 300 yards like the manual instructed, he was effectively waiting for the enemy to reach their ideal firing range. Aruth had seen it happen, again and again. B-17s flying beside him, holding tight formation, gunners sticking to the book, patiently waiting for that perfect distance. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was too late. A flash of cannon fire, plexiglass exploding, metal tearing like paper. By the time the gunner squeezed the trigger, the plane had already been hit. By the time the guns roared, the attacker was already peeling away, leaving behind a bleeding aircraft. Mission reports often use neutral phrases: attacked from the rear, aircraft lost, gunner failed to react in time. But in the tail, Aruth knew the truth was far uglier. It wasn't about lacking courage. It wasn't about poor aim. It was about doing everything right. Too right. The manual taught them to conserve ammo. But the manual didn't account for the helplessness of watching an enemy grow larger in your sights while your finger held back, waiting on an invisible command. The manual said to fire short bursts, but never said that sometimes a longer burst, just seconds earlier, might force the enemy to break off. The manual said to wait, but didn't warn that, in a head-on assault, waiting was giving the enemy the upper hand. During long hours in the air with nothing but engine noise and frozen breath inside his mask, Aruth began to turn every lesson over in his mind. Not out of rebellion, not to prove someone wrong, but because with every mission, the dining hall had more empty chairs, and those missing faces had all followed the rules. He looked out the back, through that fragile layer of plexiglass and asked himself, if a fighter was coming in fast, straight, fully visible, why wait until it was closest? Why not turn distance into an advantage? At 700 or 800 yards, the enemy was still flying straight, still hadn't dodged, still hadn't fired, and most importantly, still exposed. Questions like these had no place in official briefings. Doctrine wasn't meant to be questioned by a junior enlisted man in the tail. It was protected by rank, by statistics, by faith in a system that claimed to know better than any one individual. But up in the air, Aruth had no system to rely on. He had 2 guns, a limited belt of ammo, and a body that could bleed. Each time the plane shook from turbulence, each time light flashed across the glass and made his pulse spike, the contradiction between theory and reality became sharper. The doctrine wasn't entirely wrong. It just wasn't built for the first few seconds of a real attack. And those first seconds were exactly where fate was decided. Aruth began to grasp something terrifying. The manual didn't kill people directly. It killed them by making them slower than the enemy. By teaching patience in a war where patience meant giving someone else the chance to fire first. That realization didn't strike like lightning. It came slowly, heavily, hauntingly. And with it came a question he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. If he kept doing exactly what he was taught, maybe he'd survive a few more missions. Or maybe he'd die on the next one, just like so many others before him. But if he broke the rules, if he fired early, if he defied the doctrine, he'd become reckless. Or he'd become a survivor. And in the tight, frozen space of the tail gunner's compartment, surrounded by minus 60-degree air and the steady drone of engines ticking down the seconds, Michael Aruth began to make a decision he wasn't ready to say out loud. Maybe, to stay alive, he'd have to pull the trigger before he was allowed to. The decision to fire early didn't come in a heroic moment. There was no background music, no solemn vow, no steely gaze toward the horizon. It came like a cold equation, calculated and recalculated hundreds of times in Michael Aruth's mind, until there was no choice left but to accept the result. In the tail compartment, when the sky behind was still empty, but the sensation of being hunted had already begun to settle in, Aruth no longer thought like the manual taught him. He thought like someone with crosshairs on his back. A fighter coming head-on wasn't some unpredictable target. It didn't zigzag. It didn't hide. It came fast, on a steady line, with one goal: pull the trigger before getting hit. And in those first few seconds, its profile was largest, its trajectory most predictable. That was the moment when math sided with the gunner, not the fighter pilot. Aruth looked at his ammunition, not with fear of running out, but with a new calculation. Roughly 800 rounds for the whole mission, maybe 20, maybe 30 attack runs if things went badly. If every early burst could force a fighter to change course, then those rounds weren't wasted. They were currency, buying time. And over Germany, time was life. He knew exactly what he was doing. If he fired early and missed, it would look like panic. If he fired early and hit, no one on the ground would ever see it. There were no cameras, no witnesses. Only one thing could prove him right: the B-17 returning in one piece. The first time Aruth did it, his hands didn't shake. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because the fear had crystallized into perfect focus. When the fighter appeared far off, just a black dot in the distance, he didn't wait for it to fill the gun sight. He tracked it with an imagined lead and pulled the trigger while it was still farther out than any lesson had ever allowed. Red-orange tracers sliced through the sky, arcing straight toward the target. The fighter broke off, not because it was hit, but because its plan had been disrupted. And that was enough. It didn't fire. It didn't complete its attack. It pulled away, leaving behind a brief but priceless moment of silence. After that mission, there were no congratulations, no recognition, just suspicious looks. Early fire was seen as undisciplined, a sign of panic. Aruth was questioned, scrutinized, reminded of the procedures. He listened, he nodded, he didn't argue. He didn't need to win in the briefing room. He just needed to win in the sky. Then came Saint Nazaire. On the way in, the B-17 formation was hounded by German fighters. FW-190s appeared from the rear, attacking with the confidence of men who had done this 100 times. From the tail, Aruth saw them before anyone else, and this time he didn't wait. At a range the manual called meaningless, he opened fire. Not with a wild, desperate spray, but with deliberate, guided bursts. Tracers arced out, drawing sharp lines in the thin air. One fighter broke off immediately. The second hesitated, the third pressed forward, then veered away. The B-17s kept flying, no huge explosions, no planes lost, but also no bombers torn apart in that wave of attack. When they returned, Tandleo was intact. This time, the suspicion began to shift into something else. No one said it out loud, but the other gunners took notice. They asked in whispers. They watched how Aruth worked, and in the missions that followed, a few began to try it, firing a bit earlier. Not publicly, no declarations, just small adjustments, just enough to make a difference. Aruth never saw himself as someone rewriting doctrine. He was simply a man unwilling to die the way the manual predicted. But with each mission that ended, with each plane that came home with fewer holes, he grew more certain that he had touched a truth the training hadn't caught up to yet. In the sky, the initiative didn't belong to those who waited. It belonged to those who forced the enemy to react. He knew eventually his method would face its harshest test, not in routine sorties, but in a full-on battle where everything collapsed at once. Fighter escorts turning back, formations breaking up, enemies swarming from all directions. A day when firing early wouldn't be a choice, it would be the only way to survive. That day came on July 30th, 1943, when 186 B-17s lifted off, when the P-47s turned back at the edge of their range, and when the sky ahead opened like a massive trap, Michael Aruth crawled once more into the familiar tail section. 2 Browning guns, a finite belt of ammo, and a way of fighting that broke the rules. This time, he wouldn't just fire to scare them off. He would fire to survive for 47 minutes in a sky that turned into hell. July 30th, 1943 didn't begin with gunfire. It began with an eerie, unnatural silence. When 186 B-17s lifted off the runway, the massive formation looked like a flying metal city, slow and heavy, climbing into a dull gray sky. The engines roared steadily, the air trembled, but ahead there was nothing. No sign of the enemy. Only the feeling of being watched, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Michael Aruth sat in the tail compartment, body locked into the tiny seat, hands resting on the familiar Brownings. Through the plexiglass, he saw the formation stretch all the way to the horizon. Then he looked farther, into the empty space behind, where he knew one thing for certain. This silence would not last. When the escorting P-47s began turning back, their range limits reached. The moment felt like a door quietly shutting. No one said it, but everyone understood. From here on out, the bombers were alone. And the Luftwaffe had been waiting for this exact moment. The first black specks didn't cause panic. They were too small, too far. But Aruth didn't need them to grow to recognize their shape. Straight flight paths, high speed. These weren't scouts. This was an attack. Then more appeared, from different angles, faster, more aggressive. The sky behind the formation began to shift like the surface of water struck by stones. The first assault hit so fast, there was no time to brace. A fighter dove straight in from 6 o'clock, cannons flashing. Aruth didn't wait. He tracked the familiar lead angle and squeezed the trigger while the enemy was still further out than any training had ever allowed. Red-orange tracers tore across the air like arrows. The fighter swerved sharply, a thin trail of smoke behind it. It didn't score a hit. It didn't complete its run. But it was just one of hundreds. The sky fractured into chaos. Gunfire, metal tearing, bullets slamming into fuselages, all blending with the roar of engines into a rhythmless roar. In the tail, Aruth lost all sense of time. There was only a chain of instinct. Spot. Lead. Fire. Stop. Switch targets. Repeat. He fired at 800 yards, not out of recklessness, but because that was the only range that gave him control. Every early burst was a question thrown at the German pilot. Keep coming, or survive. And each time they broke off, the B-17 behind Aruth gained a few more precious seconds. One FW-190 didn't break. Tracers struck its fuselage, a burst of flame. The plane shuddered, rolled hard, then dropped out of sight. Aruth didn't celebrate. He wasn't even sure he downed it or just crippled it. He only knew, for now, the rear was clear. Then another came, and another. Plexiglass exploded with a dry crack. Shards of plastic and metal ripped into the compartment, slicing flesh. A brutal wave of minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit air surged in, sharp as a blade. Aruth felt the sting, then the numbness. He looked down. There was blood on the floor. It wasn't flowing. It froze the moment it touched the air. One gun jammed. No time for anger. He switched to the other, his hands moving on pure reflex. Outside, another fighter bore down. Aruth fired. Tracers connected. The German aircraft broke apart in a burst of light and vanished beneath the formation. The B-17s were being shredded. Gaps opened where tight formation had once been. Aruth saw bomber bodies torn, flames blooming, planes falling slowly like wounded animals too tired to fight back. There was no time to grieve. Every second of distraction could be the last. Ammo ran low. The number in his mind ticked down, cold and sharp. 200, 150, 100. Every burst had to matter. Every target had to be chosen fast and hit hard. No room for hesitation. A Bf-109 appeared, more determined than the others. It didn't flinch at the tracers. It came straight on, cannons flashing. Aruth felt the B-17 shudder. He adjusted down, fired again. Tracers struck the wing. The fighter jerked violently, lost control, and fell away. For the third time that day, Aruth didn't see the final outcome. But once again, the sky behind him cleared, if only for a moment. When the latest attack wave finally ended, he realized something terrifying. The Luftwaffe's aggression had started to wane. Not because they were out of planes, but because the cost of each pass had grown too high. Every time they charged in, they faced a gunner who didn't wait, who didn't give them their ideal range, who broke the familiar rhythm of the hunt. But that price was being paid on both sides. Aruth looked at his ammo belt. 63 rounds left. That number hung in his mind, heavier than the pain, that heavier than the cold. 63 bullets for the rest of the journey. No more firing to scare. No more firing to pressure. Each round now was a wager, life or death. The gunfire slowed. The German fighters began to peel away, not in defeat, but because the battle had reached its peak. The sky behind the formation grew suspiciously quiet. Aruth exhaled slowly, his lungs burned from the cold. He didn't take his hands off the trigger. Not yet. Ahead, the road home was still long. 250 miles of enemy airspace, one working gun, 63 rounds and a wounded body, fighting through cold and exhaustion. 47 minutes of hell were behind him. But the battle for survival wasn't over. It had only changed into something quieter, colder, crueler. And Michael Aruth knew. From this moment on, every bullet he fired would be the final calculation on the road back. After 47 minutes in a sky that felt like a giant meat grinder, the silence returned. More terrifying than the gunfire. It wasn't peace. It was the void after the storm, where every nerve remained taut, bracing for the next blow. Michael Aruth stayed in the tail, his back pressed to the tiny seat, hands still resting on the triggers. Through the cracked plexiglass, the sky behind him was possibly empty. 63 rounds. That number wasn't just in the ammo belt. It was in his mind, pulsing like a new heartbeat. 63 rounds for the remaining 250 miles. No room for mistakes. No such thing as warning shots. Each bullet now carried the weight of a final decision. The plane shuddered more steadily than before. Engines still roared, but there were no more sounds of metal being torn apart. In the headset, the pilot's voice came through. Deep, measured, trying to stay calm. They were leaving the worst behind. But no one dared to say the word safe. Over enemy territory, safety was nothing more than a fragile assumption. The cold dug deeper. With the plexiglass shattered, the tail compartment had become a massive wind tunnel. Aruth's breath turned into white mist, clinging to his mask before disappearing. The pain from his wounds had dulled, not sharp anymore, but heavy, like his body was slowly losing its ability to react. He didn't let himself dwell on it. Pain meant he was still alive, and being alive was all that mattered. Each passing minute became a new calculation. If a fighter appeared, shoot or don't shoot, how many rounds, at what range? 63 bullets allowed for no panic. But somehow that paradox made Aruth sharper than ever. When resources run low, the brain sharpens, cold and merciless. A dark speck appeared far off in the distance. Aruth spotted it at the same moment his heart began to race. A lone Bf-109, maybe a latecomer, maybe a pilot unwilling to miss one last opportunity. It didn't charge immediately. It held its distance, testing, like a predator that smells blood but remains cautious. Aruth didn't fire. Not yet. 63 rounds forced him to wait, but not the way the manual had taught. He waited only until he was certain that if he pulled the trigger, there'd be a result. The fighter dipped low, then accelerated. committing. In that moment, Aruth tracked it, not too early, not too late. 12 rounds left the barrel. Tracers hit the fuselage. The Bf-109 jolted, veered hard, and dropped beneath the formation, trailing smoke. Aruth didn't count the hit. He didn't need to. The sky behind was clear again, 51 rounds. No more fighters appeared for a long while, but the tension didn't fade. It merely stretched itself thin. Every cloud could hide a killer. Every tremor in the fuselage tensed his muscles. Then, the channel. The horizon shifted subtly. The heavy gray of land gave way to the cold blue of sea. No one cheered. No one sighed in relief. But in the tail, Aruth felt something he didn't dare name. They'd passed through the worst. Not the end, but the threshold. When the wheels hit the runway, the jolt nearly knocked him out. The engines wound down. The metal creaked and ticked as it cooled. The tail hatch opened and warm air flooded in. Afternoon sunlight spilled through, revealing frozen streaks of blood across the floor. He didn't walk out. They carried him off the plane. The faces around him were exhausted, silent, but their eyes were different. Not the eyes of victors, the eyes of people who had just survived something they knew they'd never want to repeat. Later, as the adrenaline ebbed, the questions began to surface. Not loud arguments, just quiet, practical questions, impossible to ignore. Why did this B-17 come back with fewer holes? Why were the rear attacks broken off earlier? Why had a tail gunner, whose firing pattern had been dismissed as reckless, survived one of the worst days of the air war? The answer wasn't in Aruth's words. He gave no speeches. He didn't try to explain. The answer lay in things that couldn't lie. The spent ammo belt, the number of rounds fired, the engagement distances, and most of all, the number of aircraft that made it home. When the technical officers began compiling the data, when the numbers were laid side by side with cold detachment, one fact became impossible to ignore. The early rounds hadn't been wasted. They were barriers, they had disrupted enemy behavior. And from those unfeeling figures, the story of Michael Aruth began to leave the cramped tail compartment to enter another space. A space where doctrine was no longer shielded by belief, but confronted by data that didn't lie. Air warfare doesn't change because of a story retold or a soldier being praised. It changes when the numbers force people to face the truth. After July 30th, 1943, Michael Aruth didn't step out of the tail as a hero. He stepped out as an anomaly, a troubling exception in a system that preferred smooth operations and strict doctrine. Ammo belts were removed and laid out on cold metal tables in the technical room. They counted every round fired, matched it against engagement times, against his aircraft's position in the formation. There was no emotion in those numbers, only silence, as the data began revealing inconsistencies too obvious to ignore. Aruth's average engagement distance was far longer than standard. The number of German fighters forced to break off before reaching optimal firing range was higher. And most importantly, the survival rate of B-17s in formations with tail gunners adopting early fire tactics was measurably better. No one rushed to declare anything. The U.S. Air Force didn't rewrite doctrine over one brutal mission. But those responsible for the lives of hundreds of aircrews began asking careful questions. If firing early didn't dangerously deplete ammo, if firing early forced the enemy to react, instead of letting them dictate the attack, then maybe it wasn't as reckless as once thought. Reports began to shift in tone, not full of praise, but written in the dry language of statistics. Fewer successful fighter approaches, changes in attack angles, longer exposure of enemy planes within defensive range, resulting in higher risk for them. The numbers didn't argue, they simply existed like the bullets that had already been fired. In briefing rooms, no one mentioned Michael Aruth by name. Instead, they talked about early firing patterns, extended engagement distances, psychological impact on enemy pilots. That was how the system protected itself, by turning a man into a variable. But in doing so, it allowed change to begin, quietly, steadily. In the skies, change moved faster. Other gunners started to follow his lead, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. They didn't abandon the manual, they adapted it, adding flexibility where once there was none. And the result was something no speech could produce. More B-17s came home. Aruth watched it all from his familiar place, not with satisfaction, but with a heavier awareness. Every improved stat came with the memory of those who died before this shift was accepted. Data doesn't lie, but it doesn't comfort either. It only tells you what the cost was, to reach what now feels like an obvious conclusion. The change in doctrine didn't happen all at once. It seeped into squadrons, into missions. Younger gunners were now encouraged to think more actively, not just to wait for a fixed range. They were taught that the sky was a dynamic battlefield where every second could change the outcome. And in that quiet shift, Aruth's legacy lived on, not in name, but in how the tail gunner's role was redefined. But war is a two-way dialogue. Every change on one side creates a response on the other. The German pilots weren't blind. They sensed the difference from the very first new encounters. Tracers appeared earlier. Pressure increased before they even reached familiar range. Flight paths that once felt safe were suddenly dangerous. Enemy reports began to shift as well. 6 o'clock attacks were no longer clean. Losses increased, not because American gunners were more accurate up close, but because the fight was happening sooner, forcing fighters to stay exposed longer under fire. And as enough data piled up on both sides, one thing became undeniable. The sky was entering a new phase. No longer a one-sided hunt where fighters dove in and escaped unscathed. It was becoming a constant duel, a mental chess match, where each side had to read the other's intent before pulling the trigger. Michael Aruth didn't need to know that. Somewhere in a Luftwaffe command room, similar conversations were taking place. He could feel it in the air, in the way fighters approached with new caution from different angles at different speeds. The enemy had learned his lesson. And when the enemy learns, when the sky no longer follows the old rhythms, that is the clearest sign that a new balance is forming. The data had said all it could. From here on, the war would move into a new chapter, one where the Luftwaffe would have to change how it hunted, to face gunners who no longer waited in silence. The Luftwaffe didn't need long reports to realize something had changed. In the sky, change is always felt before it's ever written down. German pilots, long accustomed to the rhythm of rear assaults, began to sense that the safe space, the buffer that once existed, was gone. Tracers appeared sooner, pressure arrived faster, and most importantly, the moment of control was no longer entirely in their hands. At first, their response was instinctive: go faster, rush in quicker. If the safe distance had been stretched, the only answer was to shrink the time spent exposed to fire. The Bf-109s and FW-190s dove in at blistering speed, sharper angles like blades trying to slash quickly and get out before being caught. But speed had a price. Aiming windows shortened, margins of error widened, and just one burst of early gunfire connecting was enough to shatter the entire attack path. When speed stopped being a sufficient answer, attack angles began to shift. Some pilots tried oblique approaches, using the sun, using clouds, anything to buy a few extra seconds unseen. In theory, this reduced pressure from tail gunners. In practice, it opened other vulnerabilities, putting them into the firing arcs of side gunners, who had also begun learning to fire earlier. The hunt no longer followed a familiar script. It became a constant experiment, a sequence of adjustments, each German pilot having to find for himself how to survive in a sky that no longer played by the old rules. And in that process, a cold realization emerged. Tail gunners were no longer passive targets. There were now men back there, behind the formation, who didn't wait, didn't flinch, and refused to let any approach unfold on the predator's terms. That shift came with an inevitable cost. Losses climbed, not catastrophically, but enough to catch the attention of commanders. Veteran pilots were now tasked specifically with neutralizing these aggressive gunners. Names weren't spoken aloud, but they circulated behind closed doors. The mission was no longer just to shoot down B-17s. It was to eliminate those in the rear who were breaking the rhythm of the entire tactic. Michael Aruth sensed the change not through reports, but through behavior. Attacks became more probing, more calculated, but more dangerous. Some fighters didn't charge immediately. They waited, watching, hunting for a moment of inattention. Sometimes the pressure didn't come from gunfire, but from being watched for so long that your nerves began to fray. But in that tension, a strange paradox emerged. As the Luftwaffe was forced to juggle too many variables, speed, angle, priority, their greatest advantage began to slip away: deadly simplicity. Every hesitation, every test meant more time exposed. And with each moment exposed, the chance of being hit grew. Aerial combat was evolving into a battle of minds, no longer about fixed rules, only chains of action and reaction, where both sides tried to stay half a step ahead. Victory in the sky no longer belonged to brute strength, but to whoever could force the enemy to play to their tempo. For Aruth, this meant the pressure never eased. It only became more refined. He wasn't facing swarms anymore. He was facing pilots willing to take greater risks to remove one very specific threat: him. Each mission took a heavier toll. Wounds not yet healed. A body pushed beyond fatigue. But the sky doesn't allow for rest. And like any endless race, it eventually approached a limit. A point where all the tactical adjustments in the world could no longer balance the accumulating risks. That point wasn't marked in red on any map. Its name was Stuttgart. When the mission was announced, there was no bravado, only the heavy silence of men who understood exactly what waited ahead. For Michael Aruth, Stuttgart wasn't just another bombing run. It was the final test of everything he had done and everything that had changed in the sky. A place where the line between adaptation and exhaustion would grow thinner than the plexiglass that once shielded him. And as the B-17 lifted off once more, carrying those who had learned to survive inside the contradictions of air war, Aruth knew. The dialogue with the Luftwaffe was about to enter its most brutal chapter. There was little room left for error, even less space to learn. Stuttgart was waiting, the final threshold the sky had drawn for both sides. The Stuttgart mission wasn't introduced with grand speeches. It arrived quietly, just a piece of paper laid on the table in the briefing room, its numbers alone enough to make everyone understand. This wasn't a routine flight. Longer distance, heavier enemy presence, time spent over enemy skies stretched so far that every minor mistake could snowball into catastrophe. Stuttgart wasn't a place to prove anything. It was where the true limits would be revealed. When their B-17 took off, the sky seemed heavier than before. Not from clouds or wind, but from the collective understanding that this mission would drain every last reserve of strength, physical and mental. Michael Aruth crawled into the familiar tail compartment. The metal was just as cold as always, but something had shifted. There was no more tense anticipation, no more thrill of testing a theory, only the quiet focus of a man who'd gone too far to still believe in luck. On the approach into enemy territory, the attacks came earlier than expected. The Luftwaffe didn't wait. The fighters arrived with speed and precision, proving they'd learned their lesson. No more predictable dives. They came in tight packs, shifting altitude, changing approach angles, trying to force the B-17 into a constant state of reaction, never a moment to recover. Aruth fired early, as he always had. But this time, every burst felt heavier. Not from lack of ammo, but because his body was beginning to betray him. Old wounds flared with every shudder of the aircraft. The cold reached deeper, stiffening his fingers, demanding a little more will with every squeeze of the trigger. But the sky didn't care about limits. It only asked again and again, how much more can you take? As the formation pushed deeper, flak from the ground thickened. Black clouds burst all around them, each explosion a punch to the chest. Shrapnel slammed into the fuselage, the impacts sharp enough to be felt in his bones. Aruth couldn't see Stuttgart. All he saw was a sky shredded by metal and fire. A violent jolt nearly threw him from his seat. The plexiglass cracked even further. Icy air ripped through, slicing across his face like a blade. A new pain stabbed deeper, sharper. But there was no time to check. A fighter was charging. Fast, committed. Aruth tracked, fired, tracers connected. The German plane banked hard and dropped from view. Then another came, and another. As if the sky would never run out of predators. When the bombs were finally released, no one felt relief. Completing the drop didn't bring triumph. It only marked the halfway point. And the second half was always worse. The way home. Tandlio had been hit hard. The engines were failing. The fuselage was riddled, scarred like a body covered in old wounds and fresh bleeding. Aruth felt the change in how the aircraft moved through the air. Every tremor lasted longer, hit harder. He knew they were at the edge between flight and failure. The attacks came less frequently, but they were no easier. Every fighter now was a death sentence waiting to be written. Aruth fired less, aimed more. Every bullet was a negotiation with the sky. And when another burst of cannon fire ripped through the aircraft's skin, he realized what no one dared to say. They might not make it back to land. The decision to ditch in the sea wasn't made in panic. It came calm, almost cold. A choice between two different deaths. When the word came down the intercom, Aruth didn't react. He just nodded as if it was the inevitable end of a chain of events long understood. As the B-17 dropped in altitude, the ocean came into view, wide, cold, unforgiving. There was no room for error. The impact was brutal. Aruth's body was hurled forward. Water flooded in, freezing, stealing his breath. But in the chaos, one truth could not be denied. They were alive. One by one, the crew escaped the sinking wreck. No one said much. There was no need. The fact that everyone survived was so rare it bordered on impossible. As the B-17 disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it steel, ammunition, and the last physical traces of the battle, Aruth watched, not with grief, but with the total exhaustion of someone who had reached the end. Stuttgart didn't bring glory. It brought an ending. Not the end of the war, but the end of a chapter. With fresh wounds on top of old ones, Aruth didn't fly again as before. His body had finally said what the sky had been whispering for some time. Everyone has a limit. But at that limit, something else began. When Aruth stepped away from the tail gunner's seat, his story didn't sync with the wreck. It came back with him, into training rooms, into conversations among those who'd survived. Not as a legend, but as hard-earned knowledge, paid for in blood. And from that point on, as the engines no longer roared behind him each day, Michael Aruth stepped into a new role. No higher rank, no greater power. Only one thing to offer: everything he had learned by daring to pull the trigger first, and the cost of going all the way to the edge. From that, the legacy of a man without rank began to take shape, quiet, steady, and more enduring than any medal. When Michael Aruth left the gunner's seat behind, when the tail compartment was no longer the place he returned to each foggy morning, war didn't end for him in the way most people imagine. There was no ceremony, no moment where a chapter was declared closed. Just another morning, one where he woke up without dragging himself into a heavy flight suit, without checking oxygen levels, without resting his hands on two cold guns. The silence, now, no longer frightened him. It carried a different weight, the weight of everything that remained. Aruth carried wounds not always visible. His body had been worn down by cold, by constant vibration, by impacts no medical manual could prepare for. But heavier than all of that were the memories. The faces that never came back, the gaps in the formation, the sudden silence after a call over the radio. That was war's first legacy, and it was not something he could pass on to anyone else. When he began training new recruits, no one called him a doctrinal reformer. He didn't call himself that either. In the classrooms, he was just a staff sergeant with a quiet, gravelly voice and the eyes of someone who'd seen too much. He didn't command. He told stories. Stories about the first few seconds of an attack, about seeing the enemy too clearly through the gun sight, and knowing that if he waited one heartbeat longer, he might not get the chance to pull the trigger at all. The young men listened, first with curiosity, then with silence. Not because the stories were tragic, but because they realized something unsettling. Nothing Aruth said contradicted the manual, but all of it lived in the spaces the manual never touched. He never told them to break rules. He just reminded them that rules were never complete when your life depended on guessing what a man trying to kill you would do next. Aruth's legacy wasn't written into official orders. It spread the way all real survival knowledge spreads. From person to person, through short conversations, through whispered advice before takeoff. Don't wait too long. Think like the guy coming at you. Don't let them control the tempo. The new tail gunners didn't know his name, but they knew how to fire a second earlier. The young pilots never read his reports. But they flew with the sense that the rear wasn't just waiting anymore. And in the sky, that shift continued to save lives, quietly, without a sound. There were medals, shiny metal, tidy ribbons. Aruth accepted them politely, then set them aside. They couldn't capture the moment he pulled the trigger before the manual said he should. They couldn't hold the minus 60-degree air, the smell of cordite, the feel of frozen blood on aluminum. Medals recognized action, but his legacy lived in the consequences. War kept changing. New planes arrived, new tactics emerged. What Aruth had done slowly became just another layer in a larger evolution until no one could quite remember where it began. And strangely, that was the clearest proof of his impact. When a survival idea becomes normal, it no longer needs a name attached to it. After the war, Aruth's life bore none of the markings of legend. He didn't stand on podiums. He didn't write dramatic memoirs. He lived quietly at a slower rhythm, as someone used to watching more than speaking. And occasionally, when asked about what he had done, he would simply say, "I just tried not to die the way they said I would." Perhaps that was the true essence of his legacy. Not boldness, not recklessness, but the ability to ask the right question inside a system built to prevent anyone from asking. He didn't break discipline. He simply reminded others that discipline exists to serve the living, not to bury them. The ones who lived because of those changes never met him. They didn't know that somewhere, years before, a young tail gunner sat in a freezing compartment and decided that waiting was no longer an option. But every time they came back, every time the wheels touched down, that legacy continued, even if no one said its name. Michael Aruth didn't leave behind a doctrine bearing his initials. He left behind a gap in the old thinking, just wide enough for others to step into and start thinking for themselves. And in war, where everything is decided in a matter of seconds, that gap was the most valuable thing a man without rank could leave behind. Michael Aruth passed away like so many others who had survived war, only to quietly slip away from the world. There was no long procession winding through city streets, no roaring engines overhead to honor his departure. Just a name etched into stone, a clean line confirming that a man had once existed. If someone stopped long enough, they might see a birth date, a death date, maybe a short note about his military service. But gravestones don't tell stories. They don't speak of the frozen mornings at RAF Kimbolton, of crawling into the tail compartment with skin cracked from the cold. They don't tell of the first seconds when tracers tore through the sky, or the moment he chose to fire before he was allowed to. The most important stories of war rarely make it onto stone. They live in the moments no one had time to record, in the decisions made when there was no time to ask for permission. They exist in the silence after a landing when men looked at each other and understood something had happened, but didn't yet have the words to name it. Michael Aruth isn't remembered for following every rule. If he is remembered at all, it's for surviving by refusing to accept a pre-written death. In a system built on procedure, he dared to trust his own experience, not to defy that system, but to patch the gaps it hadn't yet noticed. And those gaps, that's where war actually happens. War doesn't change because people follow the book flawlessly. It changes when someone realizes the situation has shifted before the orders do. These people are rarely celebrated properly because what they do is often too small to be mythologized, but far too important to be forgotten. A burst of gunfire, a fighter forced to break off, a bomber that returns home instead of disappearing into the sea, all too fleeting for stone, yet strong enough to save lives. When we look back at wars in history books, we see maps, arrows, dates, numbers, but maps don't show minus 60-degree Fahrenheit in a tail gunner's chair. Arrows don't show fingers frozen stiff, and numbers don't carry the fear of knowing that one more heartbeat of hesitation could mean the end. Those things live only in the memories of those who were there, and in the stories passed on, if someone is willing to listen. Michael Aruth didn't leave behind a comfortable lesson. His story isn't a tribute to reckless bravery. It's a quiet reminder that in moments of life and death, rigid thinking can kill just as fast as the enemy. His story says that courage doesn't always lie in advancing on command. Sometimes it lies in pausing for half a second to ask, is this still right? Maybe that's why stories like Aruth's rarely make it onto headstones. They don't fit into a single, tidy line. They ask too much: time, patience, and a little courage from both the teller and the listener. The courage to accept that history isn't just made by generals and orders, but by unnamed people who made the right choice at the right moment, in silence. If you've followed this story all the way to the end, perhaps you've felt that too. History isn't just the past, it's a collection of moments where people stood at a crossroads, to follow or to think, to wait or to act. And sometimes, it's the unrecorded choices that keep the world turning. If you have your own thoughts on Michael Aruth's story, leave a comment below. What do you believe truly shifts the outcome of a war? Doctrine, or those who dare to question it at the right time? And if you want to keep exploring quiet but decisive moments in history, don't forget to subscribe to History War. Together, we'll keep the stories alive, especially the ones that were never carved in stone.